I'm pleased to introduce Dr. Geoffrey West. He's very likely had the origin of our 20% time. It's a funny story. We had it over lunch. I invite you to ask him about it sometime. He's a theoretical physicist whose primary interests have been in fundamental questions of physics, especially those concerning the elementary particles, their interactions, and cosmological implications. His long-term fascination in general scaling phenomena evolved into a highly productive collaboration on the origin of universal scaling laws that pervade biology from the molecular genomic scale up through mitochondria and cells to whole organisms and ecosystems. And many of these ideas, I think, form the basis of his book that he's here to talk about today, Scale, the Search for Simplicity and Unity, in the Complexity of Life from Cells to Cities, Companies to Ecosystems, Milliseconds to Millennia. Please join me in giving him a warm welcome today.
Thank you. Thanks for inviting me. And whoops, I'm getting that light. So I'm going to give a relatively short presentation. Short meaning I hope I can keep it to about 30 minutes. Giving an overview of what this book is about, and it covers a huge territory. So it's very impressionistic. It'll be non-technical. The book is non-technical. The presentation will be non-technical. But it deals with a lot of deeply technical and challenging problems. And it's encapsulated in the title, which is here. But there was this cute thing that Penguin Press, who produced the book, produced, and I can't help showing it to begin. Which is kind of fun. There you go. How cute. So I'm a physicist, and as was said in the introduction, I spent most of my career doing high-energy physics, quarks and gluons and string theory and dark matter and so on and so forth. And in a way, what this book is about and what this talk is about is sort of taking that way of thinking and asking how far can you push it in terms of thinking about biology, organismic life, and socioeconomic life. And so a lot of what I'm going to talk about is going to be about cities and companies, and I'm also going to talk a little bit about biology. But the framework really is is trying to ask, to what extent can you make a quantitative, predictive, mathematizable, computable science of biological phenomena, biomedical phenomena, and in some ways more importantly, for what I want to talk about, socioeconomic phenomena. And really the passion behind all this was the fundamental question as to whether this extraordinary enterprise that we've developed over the last, well, most 10,000 years, maybe only really the last couple hundred years, is actually sustainable in principle. So that's what I'm going to try to lead up to. And as I said, it's inspired by work that I've done in physics and in biology. So the first thing is that everybody knows that we live in an exponentially, whoops, is this going to be someone help me? If I press that, oh, a picture of a bridge. Actually, I talk about bridges in the book, ironically. The design of bridges. Very good. So everybody knows we live in a exponentially expanding universe, but what is often not appreciated is that, of course, we live in an exponentially expanding socioeconomic universe, and it's, some figures that you're probably familiar with in one form or another, that 200 years ago, when this country was founded, it was almost entirely agricultural and rural, and it's now become overwhelmingly urbanized. It's about 82% of the US population that lives in cities. And just a couple of years ago, the world crossed this amazing point of being over half urbanized, and it's moving towards that 70 to 80% mark in the next 50 years. So this is extraordinary, but it's sort of interesting to put it into sort of more capturable terms, and that is, if you just average over the next 30 to 40 years, that is equivalent to adding about almost 1.5 million people a week to cities, building that infrastructure. That means building a New York metropolitan area every couple of months, or a Seattle, the city of Seattle, every few days. That's what's going. It's sort of extraordinary. So this is everything that we do is sort of with that backdrop, this phenomenon that is taking place. And, it's again represented by this. This is China. China was very slow to urbanize. The yellow there is the rural, the red is the urban, and it's crossed the halfway mark, and it is heading towards this 80% mark very rapidly, and that is represented by its claim to be building 200 to 300 new cities in the next 15 to 20 years, each in excess of 1 million people. So the stress and strain on energy, resources, and in particular on the social fabric are phenomenal, and this is just China. We have India, we have Latin America, and of course we have Africa. And of course all of this is a reflection of this incredible super exponential growth of population. This begins when we started to urbanize, when we stopped being hunter-gatherers, and it's sort of extraordinary. I look at this graph, and I'm looking up at it there. I was born in 1940, where there were just over 2 billion people on the planet. There's now 7.5 billion, and by the time many of you are dead, it will be 10 to 12 billion. So that's unbelievable. And so somehow we've got to sort of think of this in much bigger terms than what its effect is even just on global warming or on the environment or on health and energy and so on. We need to sort of develop a much bigger picture. And all of this is manifested again in this idea of open-ended growth, which has been so extraordinarily successful in bringing us to this point. And just to give another marker, another metric of it, this is the growth in the US GDP since roughly the Civil War. If you'd invested $1 in the stock market in about 1870, it would now be worth $1 million, even allowing for inflation. So this is just a metric of the extraordinary expansion of the economy. Now, all of this is bound up with the development of cities, the urbanization that I talked about briefly. So one can immediately identify that the fate of the planet, if you tell me what to press, it's marvelous that this is happening at Google. I love it. This is a marvelous. Can you imagine the stories I could tell about this? By the way, I gave a talk at the Google, Mountain View, about 5 years, I forget, maybe longer, 7 years ago. And, I'm very old-fashioned. I'm about 3 times as old as most of you, as far as I can tell. But I said, I'm coming. And then 2 days before I said, they said, send us the PowerPoint. I said, PowerPoint? You must be kidding. I said, I have a bunch of transparencies. And you know what? They got back and they said, what's that? So I explained, and they had to go out and Google, had to go out and buy an overhead projector so I could give my talk, which was, I can just talk.
Talk.
Maybe I'll just have to talk.
Yeah.
If you don't mind, I'll use my PowerPoint as notes to just talk. You will miss the graphs, and you're just going to have to use your vivid imaginations. So, let's see. So I have lovely pictures of cities. So, so the point is that the future of the planet is now really the future of the cities, or the future of the cities is the future of the planet. The fate of the planet is completely intertwined with what's happening in cities. And so there is an urgent need to develop a deep understanding of cities, not just a qualitative narrative version of cities, which has been the traditional way of thinking about cities, but via urban geography, urban planning, urban economics, but sort of a more scientific viewpoint, and ask, is it even possible? Is it possible to have that? Is it possible to develop a science of cities that could lead to understanding their structure, their dynamics, their growth and evolution, so that we can understand likewise the growth of the socioeconomic life that we've developed and lead into what I've tried to term a sort of, so to speak, a grand unified theory of sustainability. So that's been my passion for the last several years, and you know, we all understand why cities are very attractive. You know, it's a place where there's greater opportunities, there's greater buzz, there's more cultural events, there's greater access to good restaurants and so forth. And this has been the great attractor. Is it going to come? No, no, no.
No, it just doesn't like me today.
And I have marvelous pictures here. But, you know, all of this, all of the marvelous things, and look, I mean, my God, you live in one of the most energetic cities on the planet. I mean, just, my God, I was looking at all the construction downtown. It's phenomenal. But all of that requires energy. So fundamentally, at some fundamental level, obviously energy has to come in. And I'm sure most of you are familiar with the second law of thermodynamics, which says, roughly speaking, that if you try to create lots of order, then you pay...
Sorry.
We can go back.
Yes.
Okay, so 1 second. Let me see where I can... okay, so that's what I was saying. I didn't... and similar. And this is just the images of why cities are exciting and important. But all of that requires energy. And as I said, you know, from the second law of thermodynamics, which after all is the most fundamental law of all physics, it's the one thing that is immutable, creating order necessarily produces disorder, produces entropy. And so in creating cities and creating socioeconomic order, we of course create socioeconomic entropy, which means that we create things like this, and this, and this, and this, and this, and of course this. Social unrest and so on, all of these are created by this extraordinary phenomenon, and much of what's going on in the world in terms of this kind of unrest, even if it's put in cultural and political and ethnic terms, is almost certainly a large part of that is just due to this extraordinary phenomenon that's going on. And one of the questions to ask is this what cities are going to end up looking like? Is it all going to end up being sort of slums and so forth, which is happening in many parts of the world, or even this? And so that's what I want to sort of lead up to. So, you know, when we think of cities, and I just talked about Seattle a moment ago, the image is one of the physicality of the city. That is, the infrastructure, the roads, the buildings and so forth. When you think of Paris, you think of the Eiffel Tower and the boulevards and so forth. You think of New York, the skyscrapers. But in fact, the most important part of a city is, of course, the people, because the whole point of a city is people, and the whole point of a city is to facilitate interactions like this. So this is really what you should think of as a city. There's the backdrop, the physicality, the roads and the transport systems and the buildings are really the stage upon which interaction takes place. And there's a marvelous picture of Rome, where you see that the backdrop has been there for 2,000 years. People have changed, but there's still a place to provide interaction. And this is a marvelous picture of New York 120 years ago or so. And you can viscerally feel, you know, the entrepreneurship, the idea creation, and so forth that's taking place there. And this is what cities are for. And again, those buildings are still there. The people are no longer there. There's different people. They're not on the streets. They're in buildings. But those buildings and that stage is to facilitate interaction, to create wealth, to create ideas, to innovate, and so on. Places like this. That's what cities are for. So one of the dynamics of any socioeconomic system, but in fact of any complex system, is the tension between the physicality, the energy, the resources, the buildings in this case, but the flow of energy, the metabolism of the system, the tension between that and the information exchange that goes on between parts. Yeah.
So in your lecture, what's the definition of a city or urban area?
Can I wait till near the end and I bring that up again? Because that's a very That's a very challenging question. It's been a question for eons. What is a city? And we'll come back to that, but I need to go through stuff, and then I will give you a definition of a city, an operational definition. So there's this tension between, so to speak, the thermodynamics and the information exchange, that those pictures we saw show that. And also the recognition that almost all the problems that we face, whether it is global warming or it's the question of, do we have enough energy, do we have enough resources, the questions of crime, pollution, health, and so on, all these are generated in an urban environment primarily, and so urbanization can be thought of as the source of the tsunami of problems that we feel we face across the planet, but they're also the solution because of the very reason I said earlier. They are magnets or vacuum cleaners that suck up the smart people. All the, almost all the great ideas and almost all the wealth that's created is created in some kind of urban environment. And associated with that is that all of these various things, this is just an incomplete laundry list of many things that are part of a socioeconomic system. Let's see, should I connect? Yeah, I'm going to press that. Did that help? Hey. I'm not just good at flipping transparencies, apparently. Okay. So an important aspect, typically we treat each one of these, roughly speaking, autonomously or semi-autonomously. That is, like we think only of global warming, or we only think of energy, or we only think of health issues and so on. But all of these are themselves highly complex systems. They're each adapting and evolving, and they are all, most importantly, interacting with each other. And so if you only treat one and only think of one and stay quite stovepiped, you have the classic problem of all kinds of unintended consequences because of the neglected interactions with everything else. So it's very important to develop an integrated, bigger picture in order to see all these things as part of an integrated whole. So now I'm going to switch gears, and I'm going to talk a little bit about biology as a way to leading back into some of these questions of cities and ultimately that of companies, and then sustainability. So first of all, if you're going to have a science of one of these systems, a kind of physics of a city, there's no way that there's a Newton's laws of cities. That meaning that there's a bunch of principles from which you can calculate anything. So that, physics is best represented by the fact that we know the position of a satellite to almost any degree of accuracy, so that we can use our cell phones and bounce things off and the whole IT enterprise can work. But that works because we can do that to any degree of accuracy. But the idea that you can do that in a complex adaptive systems, such as an organism or a city, is clearly extremely unlikely. Nevertheless, you could have a theory that is what I would call coarse-grained. That is, you can get the generic properties of the system and understand those. So there's kind of an in-between of not being able to address any of the questions to having something predictable to any degree of accuracy. Maybe we can predict some coarse-grained, low-resolution characteristics of these systems. So here's an example. First question, why do we live 100 years and not 1,000? So why is it that I can say with absolute certainty everybody in this room will be dead in 100 years? Where in the hell does that 100 years come from? Why isn't it 1,000 years, as I say here, or 1,000,000 years, or just 10 years? Why isn't everybody dead already? Like a mouse. If you're all mice, and by the way, mice tissue, mice are almost identical to ours. So why is it that they're dead? They would all be dead if you were all mice. So why is that? Where does that number come from? And how is it generated from molecular scales? Or why is it that most of us had to sleep of the order of 8 hours last night? Why not 15 or 16 like a mouse? Or 3 or 4, like an elephant. An elephant only has to see 3 or 4 years, and a whale only a couple of hours. So where in the hell do those numbers come from? What is the dynamic that's giving rise to those? And so these are coarse-grained questions, and their answers will be coarse-grained. The idea that you can predict the lifespan of a particular individual is, maybe you can do it with some probability, but the idea that you can predict it accurately is clearly not feasible. So similarly, when we move into these socioeconomic things, are cities and companies just large organisms? They came out of biology. To what extent is Google or Seattle biological? And why is it that, given that we all die, which we've already talked about, but all companies die, but cities almost never do. It's almost impossible to kill a city. You can think of cities that have died, but in modern times, you've dropped atom bombs on cities, and 25 years later, they're fine, whereas a small fluctuation, relatively speaking, in the stock market, and you lose a TWA or a Lehman Brothers, etc. So companies are fragile, cities are very resilient, and you could ask, could you get a theory of companies, and could you predict, and here you're going to throw me out, when Google will disappear? Because I will show you all companies eventually will, like human beings. So there's just a picture. So, what happens here, or what happened here, for crying out loud? Mick Jagger and I happen to come from the same part of London and are the same age. So there you go. So we're one of these. We're a mammal, and despite the fact that we look very different, we look different from them, and they look different from each other, and their immediate environment is quite different. This swims in the ocean, and this scurries around, and we walk on 2 legs. Nevertheless, to an extraordinary degree of accuracy, 80–90%, we are actually scaled versions of one another when you look at anything that you can measure about them, anything physiological or anything about their life history. So, for example, here's the most fundamental quantity. It's called metabolic rate, namely how much food you need to eat per day to stay alive. And that's plotted on the vertical axis, and on the horizontal axis is the size, and it's plotted logarithmically, up by factors of 10. And what you see is something extraordinary. Here's probably the most complex phenomenon in the universe, metabolism, taking stuff and making it into life. Yet despite it being so extraordinarily complex, and despite the fact that each one of these organisms has evolved by natural selection with its own unique history, each subcomponent, each organ of these systems, each cell type, each genome has evolved with its own unique history, in which case you see this idea of sort of randomness of natural selection, in which case when you plotted something like this, you would expect these points to be all over this graph. They've all lined up on a very simple straight line when plotted in this way. And of course you plotted logarithmically at first, because to get a mouse and an elephant, if you try to put the mouse here and you wanted to put the elephant on the same graph and it were linear, of course it would be somewhere, I don't know, in Tacoma, I guess. Anyway, so this is a way of getting it on on the same graph, and you can see there's an extraordinary regularity. The extraordinary regularity is even more amazing when you realize that the slope of this line is less than 1, because if it were 1, you sort of vaguely understand it, because if it were linear, you say, well, you double the size of an organism, you double the number of cells, therefore you double the amount of energy that's needed. Not the case at all. The slope of this, as I've written down here, is very close to 0.75, 3/4, so that every time you double, you actually save about 25%. So there's an extraordinary economy of scale as you go up in size. So an elephant is more economic. Its cells work less hard than yours, but yours work less hard than your cat's, for example. So those two things are actually scaled versions of one another. So there it is, I've said it again there. But most importantly, in addition to this, is that this is true of any physiological or life history event. Here's a mundane one. This is heart rate, your heart rate. And you can see again, it's a pretty good straight line on this log-log plot. And the slope of this is close to -1/4, minus because it's negative. And here's you. This is your white matter to gray matter in your brain. This is the the cables versus the operating part, and you can see there's a fantastic straight line. The slope of this is very close to 5/4. Here's genes. There's more fluctuations here, but the slope is very close to 1/4. And so what you see emerge from this is this incredible simplicity underlying this extraordinary complexity, with something also amazing is that all of these seem to have slopes that are simple multiples of this number 1/4. So the number 4 plays some fundamental role in all of biology. So, and I could spend the rest of the afternoon showing you 75 or so of these damn graphs of almost everything that can be measured looks like this. Now, this is not exactly an equation, but I decided to leave this in anyway. This actually is a copy of a transparency I showed at that Google event. That's why I put it in. So, so if you look, so I said heart rates decrease. That's what that symbol means, decrease in that way of plotting it with a slope of 1/4. But it turns out lifespan, how long you live, approximately increases with that slope of 1/4. So if you multiply these two things together, the increase of lifespan going with plus 1/4, the heart rate decreasing with 1/4, you multiply them together, the 1/4s cancel. So heart rate times lifespan is an invariant, doesn't change. But what is heart rate times lifespan? It's the number of heartbeats in a lifetime. And that's the same for all of us, which is spiritually beautiful and scientifically challenging to understand. And that number is about 1.5 billion times, and here's the data. And you can see, so this is number of beats per lifespan versus their size, and we're on this. For those that quickly do the calculation, we are an exception for very good reasons, which if I have time, I will come back to at the end. So what the hell, where in the hell do all these extraordinary scaling laws come from? What is it that's driving them? What is it that's constraining the randomness and chaotic nature of natural selection? And the idea that I developed with some marvelous biologists was that underlying them is something that's common to all these systems, and is common, in fact, all socioeconomic systems, and that is that you have huge numbers of components, and you have to service those, whether they're cells or customers or workers, you have to service those in a, roughly speaking, democratic and efficient manner, and you do that, of course, by networks, and those networks are typically branching hierarchical networks. So the idea is that networks underlie this, and it is the mathematics and physics of these networks, there's different kinds, that's you. This is also you, that's your brain, that's the white to gray matter. This is also you, that's inside your cells, and that's mitochondria inside the cell. They're all networks, and the idea is that even though these networks have different physical structures, the mathematics and the generic principles underlying the structure and dynamics of flow on these networks are universal and generic. So, so now you have this theory that where you understand all of these, at least the scaling of all of these, but you also have a theory for understanding how these networks work, not only their structure, that is, if you wanted to ask me what is the radius, length, blood flow rate, stress, I don't know, on the 12th branch of your arterial network, there's a formula in my office. You can put in the numbers, put in the parameter, and you'll get the right answer for a cat, a dog, a hippopotamus, or whatever. So it's quite powerful. And once you have such a theory, you can apply it to many things. And some of them are things that I talked about, which I'm not going to talk about now, like aging and sleep. But some things I will talk about very briefly is growth, because that's crucial in your development, obviously. And let's come up with something. Maybe that I just saw an opening. Yes. You got there you are. That's you. So how did you grow? Let's do this quickly before it goes. goodness me. So what is that? So you eat, you just had lunch, you metabolize the food, it turns it into ATP, and molecules that carry your energy, and that gets delivered through the networks to your cells. At the cells, it repairs and maintains them, it replaces those that have died, and then grows new ones. So there's the equation in English. Some goes to maintenance and some goes to growth. And by the way, I will, in a few minutes, I'll do this for cities and companies, and it's the same equation, basically. I mean, you have to adjust what you mean by these things, but it's fundamentally the same. If you do that, and you put that into mathematics, that English into mathematics with this, the theory that has been developed, then here's an example. This is our growth, our meaning mammals is a rat, and these are data points, and that's the prediction of the theory. And amazingly, with the same parameters, the same few parameters like the mass of a cell and so on, you can predict the growth curve for any animal. And then the theory tells you how to rescale all those results. I could have shown you lots of those growth curves, so that everybody appears to grow in the same way. And here's just some small sampling of those. And you see they all grow, they all fit on the same universal curve that is predicted by the theory, even, by the way, cancer, tumors, which I come back to in a minute. But the important thing is there's a universal theory for growth, and most importantly for what I want to say is that it explains why it is that you grow quickly at the beginning, and something that should have maybe bothered you, why is it that you go on eating but you don't go on growing? I mean, you do, I mean, a little bit this way, but you don't grow what's called ontogenetically. You stay pretty much the same size. And then you have this stable configuration you get into. And by the way, this idea that most organisms reach a stable size and stop growing is crucial in the sustainability of life and why life has been around for 2 to 3 billion years. And of course, just jumping ahead, this is terrible when you think of an economy or a company or a city. You're supposed to be, you know, you're not supposed to go and bend over like that. It's not supposed to stop. And what is also very important is the reason, if you trace back why it is you stop growing, it is intimately related to this, what I call sublinear scaling, the fact that metabolic rate scaled with an exponent, meaning that slope of that graph was less than 1, the 3/4, was crucial that it goes, this bends over. And I could elaborate on that if anyone's interested later. So it's still showing, great. So here's a summary of some biological things. We have these extraordinary scaling laws. They're nonlinear. There's these quarter powers. It expresses an economy of scale. The bigger you are, the less is needed per cell, per capita to stay alive. I didn't emphasize this, but going along with that sublinear scaling is that the pace of life systematically slows. Hearts beat slower, oxygen diffuses across membranes slower, you live longer, and in fact, you could contract an elephant's life completely down so that it overlaps exactly that of a mouse if you follow these scaling laws. I said growth stops, and I only intimated it, you die. It bends over, you stop growing, and then you die. Okay, let's use this now as a point of departure to talk about cities. So I said this already. First question is, are cities scaled versions of one another? Is Seattle just a scaled down New York City, which is a scaled up Santa Fe, where I live, or scaled down Chicago? Are they scaled versions of one another? Well, they sure as hell don't look alike. They have different histories, cultures, geographies, and so on. On the other hand, they're all network systems. They have roads and electrical lines and so on. They're transport systems, and they're supplied by energy networks. And perhaps most importantly, that I emphasized earlier, they all have people in them. And people form social networks. This is a classic social network, picture of a social network where the nodes are people and those are their interactions. You're probably more familiar with this than I am, but these are social networks. And 2 points I want to emphasize about this. One is that there's a modularity to these networks generally because people have families and they have jobs with groups and departments and so on. So people have, so it's not just individuals, but we form groups of various sizes. And most importantly, illustrated on this, you know, we tend to draw pictures like this when we do our network theory, but we tend to forget, especially when you use words like the cloud, that all of these have to be somewhere. People have to actually be somewhere when they're on their iPhone or on their computer or whatever, doing Facebook. They have to be, you know, in a road, in their office, in the bathroom, somewhere they have to be. So they are glued, people are glued, whether they like it or not, to being in place. So there's an integration between place and information. So are cities scaled versions of one another? Well, here's some first data that we looked at. And this was something mundane. This is gas stations. It's called petrol here because these people I work with were at the ETH in Zurich. You can see this is, there's 4 European cities, and you see they scale pretty well. And the dotted line is linear. It's like biology, it's sublinear. That is, the bigger the city, the less gas stations needed per capita. Not surprising, but what is surprising is they're roughly the same slope, meaning that you save the same amount every time you double, no matter where you are, and that is about 15%. The slope of this is about 0.85 rather than 0.75 in biology. Furthermore, if you look at any infrastructure, that is, if you look at the length of all the roads, you look at the length of all the electrical lines, the power, the water lines, the gas line, whatever you can measure about infrastructure, they all have this character. They all scale in this way. They all scale with the same slope, about 0.85. And it's the same, not just in these 4 European cities, 4 European countries, but across Europe, across the United States, across China, across Japan, Colombia, Chile, wherever. Wherever you can get data, they look exactly like this. All infrastructure scales in the same way. And one interesting consequence of that is that since you get this economy of scale, that means the bigger the city, the less entropy that is produced, and therefore, it's up here, the carbon footprint gets lower per capita the bigger the city. So the greenest city in the United States is New York City. And one of the shittiest in that sense is Santa Fe, where I live, even though it's idyllic compared to living in New York. So that's fantastic, but what is even more amazing is if you look at socioeconomic quantities, things that never existed until we started learning language and building communities and ultimately cities, things like wages and something called, someone named Richard Florida called super creative people like everybody here, professional people. If you ask how does that scale with city size, plotted in the same logarithmic way, then you get similar, there's more fluctuations, more noise, but you get scaling, but you get a slope that is now bigger than 1. This is called superlinear scaling, which means that instead of every time as you increase, you get an economy of scale, the bigger you are, the less per capita. For socioeconomic quantities, wages, super creative people, the bigger you are, the more per capita, and the slopes of these are quite similar, around 1.15. What is amazing is that that's the same for almost everything else. I didn't write it on here. This is the patterns produced as a function of city size. This is just over 1.15. This is crime in Japan, a little bit bigger. This is police, tax receipts, construction, restaurants in Holland, and so on. And here's just a small panel of half a dozen of these different variables. Here's wages, I just showed you. Here's the GDP of France. Here's crime in Japan. And you can see they all have pretty much the same slope, so that any socioeconomic variable, no matter what it is, no matter where it is across the globe, scales in the same way, which is sort of extraordinary because there wasn't a Congress in 1782 where all the countries of the world decided this is how we're going to build cities and this is how we're going to build our socioeconomic system. It all evolved organically, and amazingly out of all that came something universal and similar. And here's just for the United States. This is just income, GDP, crime, and patterns readjusted, but to the same scale, but then you can see the same slope. There's quite a bit of noise in it, but you can see overall it's the same kind of thing. And one of the big questions is, where in the hell does all this come from? Why should that be? So here it is in English. If you double the size of a city in a given urban system, on average, systematically, the income, wealth, patterns, number of colleges, educational places, creative people, but also all these bad things, police, AIDS, flu, crime, social, all these things, all increase by about 15%. And at the same time, you save 15% on all infrastructure. So big cities are good if you sort of ignore this, which people are very good at suppressing, crime, pollution, disease. Big cities are good, and bigger cities are even better. So where in the hell does all this come from? So you ask yourself, what is universal about all cities? What is common across all cities? And what you quickly realize is something I've emphasized earlier. The thing that's common is that they are for people. And it may sound sort of obvious, but amazingly, if you become familiar with urban planning, urban architecture, urban economics, what you discover is people rarely play any role in those. Those subjects are almost dominated by the physicality and pure economics of the system. And so the idea is it is the universality of the mathematics and physics of social networks, the interaction of people, that is underlying this. And I don't have time again to go into any of the mathematics and the details of this to show you where it comes from. One thing I will show you is the following. One crucial thing, of course, about science is not just to have a theory that explains the observations, but to predict things. And so I'm going to give you one prediction that you can make without having to see the theory, just based on that idea. That's what I just showed you. And the idea is that the universality of that is because of the universality of human interactions. So if we could measure the number of the interaction between people as a function of city size, it should track this. Okay, so how do you do that? Well, that's been very hard until recently, but now everybody carries, of course, a cell phone, which means everybody has a little detector with them. I'm sure you're very familiar with this. In fact, maybe you probably exploit it in many ways, I'm sure. But everybody has one, and so it's like the molecules in this room, of course. It's almost as if everyone is tagged. So we know exactly where it is, we know where it's moving, who it's interacting with, and so on. So with some colleagues at MIT, we were able to get hold of this data of billions and billions of cell phone calls between people in various places, and then just do the analysis and count how the number of interactions between people scale with city size. And by the way, an interaction was, I call you, and within 6 months you call me back. So we have a relationship. Now, 6 months is, you could make it 3 months, you could make it 3, it's up to you. But to establish an interaction, a relationship. So we did that, and here's the result. You see down the bottom, and you see it's got the same slope as this. And there's 2 countries on this plot. One is the UK, and the other is Portugal. And you can see it agrees with the prediction. So it's very strong evidence that underlying this is this theory of social networks. Now I'm going to finish off very quickly. I've gone on too long, being delayed by some of this, but I'll try to finish off very quickly. First of all, I mentioned earlier that the network dynamics in biology leads to the slowing of the pace of life. That's the sublinear, the 3/4, the superlinear behavior of socioeconomic metrics, and the network underlying it. And by the way, I should say one thing about the network. The superlinearity comes about because of the positive feedback loops that we create when we interact. I talk to you, we have a discussion, then you talk to him, and then we 3 have a discussion, and blah. That's what goes on here, of course. That's what makes the whole system work. And that has this positive exponentiating behavior, which leads to this superlinear behavior. That's sort of the words for the mathematics that goes into this. But that leads, also has this curious thing that if you have this superlinear behavior, instead of the pace of life slowing down, it speeds up in a predictable fashion. And here's, so we've looked at many things at that, and here's one whimsical one. This is heart rates. This is biology decreasing with size. This is walking speed in cities as a function of size. And this is pushing the theory a little bit, but you're still part of a network when you're walking. And you can see there's fluctuations. And this is ancient data, by the way. It wasn't plotted this way, but you can see it's very good, and that was basically the prediction from the theory. And interestingly, here's something that I found in a British newspaper a few months ago. This is the city of Liverpool. And here's what it says underneath. This is amazing. Research revealed almost half the nation found the slow pace of high streets to be the biggest shopping bugbear. Not the noise and the pollution and all the rest. It's the other fucking people going so slow. Sorry, pardon me. Take it as frustration from this. And here it is. So here is a fast lane they put in. Fast lane for walkers. That was the first day they did it. So I'm going to miss, there's a marvelous quote here. Oh, here's something. This is for you. I see you buying the iPhone 5, and then shortly after Apple launches an old one, the iPhone 6. And then we got the bloody iPhone 7 driving us nuts. Okay, onward. So here's the growth equation. I want to go quickly through growth. So it's the same kind of thing. I said it earlier. You know what? You have to, of course, know you have to add up everything that's coming in, and some goes to maintain everything that's here, or maintain all the city streets and the roads, and maintain all the people. And some grows new infrastructure, new roads, grows new people, and so on. So you have to put that on. This is just a cartoon of it, and you have to put that into mathematics. And when you did it in biology, we got this. You saw, but now. The input, all of this, is super linear, and that, instead of giving rise to this, which would be a disaster in a socioeconomic system from our modern capitalist viewpoint, you get, and I just do cartoon versions of this to give you an idea, it gives you something very satisfying. It gives you this faster than exponential growth, which is what we've seen. And I'm not going to have time to show you all the data that agrees with this, and that's fantastic. So it's very satisfying. The theory is very self-consistent, and it's very predictive, but it has a fatal flaw. And you've heard this in different form, I'm sure. And that fatal flaw is this dotted line, because what the theory says is that you go to an infinite size of whatever the metric is that you're looking at in a finite time. This is called mathematically a finite time singularity. That's obviously nonsense. You can't have an infinite number of AIDS cases or infinite number of infinite amount of wages or whatever. You can't. So somewhere along here, something changes, and the theory tells you that. The theory tells you what happens is that as you approach that singularity, the system stagnates and then it collapses. That's what I've done here. So I've just symbolically written it here, and that's terrible, of course, and that's what we don't want. And so the question is, how do we avoid it? Well, we avoid it as we're going along here, when you realize that, of course, this growth was done within a certain set paradigm, a certain major innovation. We discovered coal, or we discovered iron 20,000 years ago, or whatever it was. We've invented computers, we discovered IT, whatever it is. Something it sets the, so to speak, the backdrop for this. So it's clear, if you want to have open-ended growth, continue open-ended growth, somewhere along here, before stagnation and collapse sets in, you better start over again, and you do that by a major innovation. So innovation, nothing new, is the thing that resets the clock, and you can start over again and avoid the collapse inherent in that singularity. So you start over again, and boom, off you go. And that's great, but there's another singularity that's going to come, because it's the same dynamic. So you better do it again. Sorry, somehow it didn't compile properly. That's supposed to be there. And so on. I'm sorry, I don't know what happened here. Yeah, but you get the idea. So you have this idea, so you have a theorem you can produce. If you want to have open-ended growth, you have to have continuous cycles of paradigm-shifting innovations. Great. However, here's the hitch. I said, as you go along one of these curves, life gets faster, life is speeding up. But along with that, the time between these innovations has to systematically and predictably get shorter and shorter. So the time between innovations necessarily gets shorter. And so just to make up some numbers, if it took 100 years to to make a major change 1,000 years ago, now it only takes 15 to 20 years. That's right. And so indeed, the time between, so to speak, computers, laptops, and IT was maybe 20, 30 years, I don't know, whatever. And so what this says is if you want to avoid collapse, you've got to do it again. You've got to do it soon. In fact, all the analysis shows you've got to do another major innovation analogous to IT in the next 20 years. And we can speculate as to what that might be. If not, we're going to have a potential crisis on our hands. Now, this is not I don't know who this guy is, but I picked it off, but I got permission to use it. But it's someone that did some analysis on just time to reach 10 million customers, just to give you a sense, and it's very similar. And, Ray Kurzweil has a different view of the singularity. He likes the singularity, but the singularity is sort of like the coming of the Messiah, whereas I see it quite the opposite. But this is his graph, actually. And what you see is that line is, what's plotted here is, along here is how long ago an innovation took place. So cells took place 1 billion years ago almost. But how long it took to make the change. 1 billion years ago. Now it's, 15 years ago. So, and you can fit it all on a logarithmic plot. This line is exactly what's predicted by this theory that I've just tried to outline for you. So I'm going to finish off very quickly, extremely quickly, and I leave hanging the question as to, let's go back to this. What happens here? The question of collapse, ultimate collapse, because if you take the argument to its absurd conclusion, you would have to be making a major paradigm shift every 2 years, then every 1 year, then every 6 months. Obviously not. So something has to change. Okay, so I want to finish off extremely quickly with, if I can get there, with companies. So here's a summary of just some companies. I mean, I can show you all the data if anyone's interested of companies. And what's plotted here are assets and income, just to give you a sense. The important take-home message is here, and I think this is Walmart, this one over here. And you can see there's some fluctuations here, but you see this is plotted versus number of employees. These are tiny companies of 10 to 100 people, but once it gets to be a substantial size, they follow the scaling pretty well. And the important thing about this is that it's sublinear. It's more like us. It is not like cities. And if you follow the argument through, and this is where I'm going to zoom, what did that say? It said that you stop growing and you die. Okay, so let's look at that. Here's the data. This is 30,000 US publicly traded companies from 1950 to 2010. Just all on one plot, big spaghetti plot. That's all of them, every single one. Okay. And what you see is what you sort of know. Here are all these new ones. They're zooming. All these hockey sticks zooming away. But look at these old farts. They're just sort of hanging in there. They're just going along the top like that. There they are. And then, as you see, inflation's been taking out of this. So the old farts are like me. They're sort of limping along. And all the young Turks like you are zooming and so forth. And here it is, readjusted to the stock market, the GDP. And there it is, and you can see they're dead flat, which means that a big enough fluctuation of the stock market and you're in trouble. That's one reason why companies die, and I don't have time in this because I've gone on too long to tell you about the dynamic of that. That red line, by the way, is Boeing. Going along, and I can tell you about Boeing because I've worked with Boeing. So here's the growth. That's Walmart, looking like a big hockey stick. But you notice it only goes to 1994. And here it is, taken to 2008. And that red line is a prediction of this theory. And you can see it's beginning to bend over and will go the way of all companies. It will join, it is already joining this lot, and will bend over. And the question is, it will eventually die. And this is what this last graph is. This is plotted just focus on one of these. This is the probability of dying versus the company age, and it's broken down into companies of different sizes, and this is divided into those that disappear through acquisition and merger, those between bankruptcy and liquidation. But this is one. See, 100% probability. So it's very unlikely, it's very rare for a company to live 100 years, you know many that do, and it's very rare for a company to go 200 to 300 years. I don't have time to discuss that. I discuss it in the book. I discuss lots of investigations that we've done and analysis we've done. So I'll finish there. I didn't complete everything, but I want to show you one last graph. I went on way too long. That's this one. One thing I didn't say when we were discussing metabolism is that, everybody's sitting here desperately waiting for me to finish, is operating at 90 watts. So that's all you're using. That light bulb, that's all you use, 90 watts. And what says on this graph is that if you think of that's how you evolve. That's you are as a biological animal, a mammal that fits perfectly on that metabolic rate curve. But if you ask the question, how much energy do you need to stay alive with the kind of socioeconomic activity you do, the kind of quality and standard of living you have, that number is 11,000 watts. So that's equivalent to each one of us in this room is acting as if we are about a dozen elephants or about 70% of a blue whale, which is almost as big as this whole bloody complex. And, there's 7.5 billion people on this planet, and all of them want to be like us. They all want to live at 11,000 watts. So this is a huge pressure. So I sort of stopped before telling you some speculations about survival and collapse, survivability, sustainability. But this just puts the numbers into perspective. So I'll finish there, and I'm sorry I went on for too long. Some of it was due to this, and some was my own profligacy in just getting carried away. So thank you. And to shamelessly promote, I didn't realize they put this up here, it's all in the book. It's all explained, but no equation.